Hey guys, if you are continuing on, I am so proud of you and I'm glad that we get to still learn a little bit about biology before the school year ends. And then if you know someone who hasn't, let them know that I miss them. I miss all of you guys. You are my kids, so let me know how you're doing, if you need any help, things like that. So today we are going to talk about the intro to evolution and natural selection. So I want to preface this by saying I don't care how you feel based on evolution, like if you support it or if you don't support it. I think that if you're able to make an argument for either, that's up to you. So I'm just providing you with this information because they are the standards. However, if you choose to disagree with them, that's acceptable and that's fine. So I'm not insisting that you agree with this or insisting that you believe everything that is presented to you. So I'm just presenting you with information. So what is evolution? So there's two types of evolution. There's macroevolution, microevolution. Macro means big, so that's going to be like creation of new species, which we call speciation, things like that. That's going to be the one where if you do disagree with evolution, it's probably going to be macroevolution that you disagree with. And then microevolution is much smaller, so evolution on a smaller scale, that's going to be things like a population changing over time. So from what I've seen in my experience with teaching, most people tend to agree with microevolution, and then macroevolution is where you get those disagreements. So if that's you, just know that that is normal. However you feel on this is normal. Okay? So evolution is a change in the characteristics of a species over a long period of time. So evolution does not occur over a day. It has to occur over a long period of time. This could be thousands of years, millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, depending on the species or the organism. Newer species form from older species. So what that means is that every species that exists today has formed from some former species. And then you have something called speciation. Speciation is just an evolutionary process where populations evolve and they become distinct species. What that means is you have one population and for some reason they're separated. When they're separated, you're going to have two species begin to form. So you go from that one species where you started with, and then you're going to have two distinct or separate species. In order for them to be separate species, that means they cannot interbreed. They cannot mate with each other and produce viable offspring. And by viable offspring, that means offspring that can reproduce themselves. So they may be able to make offspring, but if that offspring can't then make more offspring, that's not a viable. So an example of that would be a donkey and a horse. If a donkey and a horse mate, they form a mule. So a donkey and a horse are different species. They can mate and produce offspring. However, that mule is sterile, so that mule cannot produce any more offspring. And so we would say that the horse and the donkey are separate species because their offspring are sterile and can't produce more offspring. Natural selection tends to lead towards speciation, and we're going to talk more about what natural selection is and things like that. So just for reference, we are doing the first and second page of notes today. So this whole PowerPoint is just the first and second page of notes, and it's just an introduction to evolution and then what is natural selection. So something really cool is the endosymbiont theory, and this is basically just saying that eukaryotes evolved from prokaryotes. So the initial life form on Earth was a prokaryote, aka a bacteria, and then eukaryotes evolved from that. So what we think, and there's two organelles that provide evidence for this, the mitochondria and the chloroplast. What we think is that some prokaryote engulfed another prokaryote, and then that's how we formed the mitochondria, and that's how we formed the chloroplast if you're a plant. We think this because they have their own DNA, and that's really unique. No other organelle has their own DNA except for the mitochondria and the chloroplast. So the endosymbiont theory is basically saying that you had a bacteria it took in a different bacteria, and then that bacteria that it took in became an organelle. It became a mitochondria, it became a chloroplast. And then you evolved eukaryotes from them, because eukaryotes have organelles. Okay. So a big player in terms of evolution was Lamarck. When we talk about him, you're going to think this dude is crazy. How on earth does he think this way? Why did he think this way? But you have to remember this was a really, really long time ago, and they didn't have any information, any evidence that we do today. And so for his thinking in his time, this was profound, because he was really the first person to kind of bring up evolution. So what he thought was that organisms inherited traits within a lifetime. So it's really important you know Lamarck was big on acquired traits. Acquired traits. I will underline it because it is really important you know that Lamarck dealt with acquired traits. What that means is that an organism would develop a trait within its lifetime. Prime example would be the giraffes, and you do have this picture on your notes. So Lamarck said the reason why giraffes' necks are so long is because over a giraffe's lifetime, it would stretch its neck so that it could reach taller leaves. Yes, it would be beneficial to reach taller leaves, but we know now that giraffes can't simply stretch their neck and grow their neck, okay? That would be like you on your couch wanting to go get potato chips. You don't want to get up. So over time, you're going to stretch your arm to where it's long enough to reach your fridge. That's not really how it works. You can't acquire traits within a lifetime. Those are genetic, and so those are not acquired within a lifetime. Those are acquired during conception. Okay, so he also thought organs used a lot could grow and change shape. So if you use your brain a lot, your brain would get bigger. That's not how it works. Organisms not used would shrivel and disappear. Again, this is all happening in an organism's lifetime. So let's say that you don't use your brain, you don't think, you don't go to Miss Hall's biology class every day. Well, if you're not doing that, then your brain would shrivel and disappear. Again, not how that works. So his theory was incorrect, but again, it was important because he was really the first scientist to recognize evolution occurring. He recognized that organisms are changing, okay, but they're not changing over their lifetime, they're changing throughout many generations. And so that's where he was wrong on that. Okay. This guy is a big guy in science. His name is Charles Darwin. Again, I told you there aren't really that many famous scientists you have to remember. Charles Darwin is definitely one of them that you need to remember. So he is the father or the founder of evolution. So he basically was the first person to research evolution in a prolonged period, so over a long time, and was really the first person to get it right. So he studied finches. They're a type of bird on the Galapagos Islands. And so what he studied was that they had different shapes of beaks, depending on which island they lived on. So if you're thinking about it, birds use their beaks to consume food, things like that. So why would they have different beak shapes or different beak sizes based on the environment in which they lived? So that's what he was researching. Again, this was really profound in the time when he was researching it. There was really no other work that was going on during this time dealing with evolution. So Charles Darwin's really, really important. And he is what we call the father of evolution. You also need to know that he did study finches because it's one of the most profound and important scientific discoveries. So you definitely have to know that he studied finches and that finches are a type of bird. So Charles Darwin coined the term natural selection, which you probably will recognize as survival of the fittest. You can think of it kind of like Hunger Games. The strongest will survive, the weakest will not. That's basically what natural selection is. But it's not in terms of strength. It could be in terms of strength, but when I say the weakest will survive, what that means is those that are least adapted for the environment. So maybe a weak mouse would do better in a certain type of environment. So therefore, his weakness would actually be beneficial. So in terms of natural selection, whatever is beneficial to them doesn't mean that they're physically stronger. It just means that they are more likely to do two things. And this is the main purpose of every organism's life on Earth: survive and reproduce. If an organism has some characteristic, some trait that allows them to survive and reproduce better, natural selection is going to go, that's great. If they have something that prevents them from surviving or reproducing, natural selection is going to kick it out. Okay, so we do see that in terms of like genetic disorders that occurred or cause an organism to die before they're able to reproduce are probably not common in a population, because natural selection is going to push those aside, because if you're not able to survive, you're not passing that trait down because it is a negative trait. And so organisms with these favorable variations are always caused by mutations. Now, this is hard to think of because when you think of mutations, you think of something going wrong. Well, mutations can cause things to go wrong, and they can cause things to go better. Most of the time, they're going to be neutral, but sometimes when they create favorable characteristics or favorable genes, that's when those mutations are actually going to become a part of natural selection. So hair color would be a good example. There's like 4 different types of hair color. You could have blonde, you could have red, you could have brown, you could have black. Okay? Why are there 4 types of hair color? Well, probably what happened is there was one type of hair color, a mutation occurred, and now you can have brown or blonde hair. Keep going, many generations later, another mutation occurs, and you can have blonde, brown, or red hair. So differences in variations or differences in traits are going to be caused by those mutations and allow for there to be differences in a population. Again, really important to know that you have to survive and reproduce. It's great if you're surviving, but if you're not reproducing, you're not doing anything in terms of evolution. Evolution could care less about you. You're not doing anything important. You're just surviving. You have to survive and then reproduce. So those are the 2 factors that determine how fit an organism is for their environment. If you look at this image of the hawk and the mouse, you should have watched the video on this, and this was an actual study that was done, and it's really, really cool. So what happened is a volcano exploded and lava covered the ground. So the ground was a type of brown sand. After the lava covered the ground, we have a black sort of surface. So if you look up here, which one of these mice is easier to see, the tan or the black? The tan is a lot easier to see because it sticks out against the new background. Well, because of that, the hawk is going to eat the tan mice because they're easier prey. As the hawk reduces the amount of tan mice, that's reducing their ability to survive and reproduce. That's actually increasing the ability of the black mice to survive and reproduce. So we would say that natural selection favors, in this case, the black mouse because they're able to adapt and blend into their environment more than the tan mouse. Okay, same thing if you look at these turtles. Why do they all have different size necks? Again, that's going to go back to, well, what's the vegetation on the island like? This guy right here with a really short neck must eat plants really close to the ground. This guy right here with a really long neck must eat plants that are higher up. So let's say the island he lives on right here is going to have higher vegetation, higher plants. The island he lives on right here is going to have really short vegetation because that's all he's going to be able to reach. Okay, so in order for him to survive, there would have to be more short vegetation. So there's 4 principles that explain natural selection, and we're on the back of the first page of notes. You should see this picture right here. First one is variation. So variation is just differences, okay? There's genetic variation occurring, meaning that there's differences in DNA. If you look at the population of humans, we definitely have variation. No one looks the same unless they're identical twins, and you are very unlikely to share the exact same DNA with anyone else on Earth unless you have an identical twin. So those genetic variations cause physical variations, And it's really important to note that these variations are going to be due to mutation. Mutations are always random. Random, random, random. A lot of you will get confused on that and you'll think that, oh, well, mutations are just there and they happen whenever something needs to happen. No, they're happening all the time. Okay, they're happening all the time and they're doing so randomly. However, sometimes they may create something that's good. Sometimes it may create something that's bad. You don't know, it's random. It occurs randomly. So the first one is variation, basically just differences in a population, differences in that DNA. Second one is heritability. So what this means is variations can be inherited, passed down from parent to offspring. So that's the whole Mendelian genetics, Punnett squares, genetic disorders, all of those things can be inherited or passed from parents to offspring. So if you have stuff that can be inherited, that means evolution can act on it. So the individuals that have the best traits for their environment will survive and reproduce better. That's called fitness. So fitness is the ability of an organism to survive and reproduce. The more fit you are does not mean you can do more push-ups, does not mean you can do more sit-ups in terms of evolution. It means you can survive and reproduce better. Evolution doesn't care about how many miles you run a day. Okay, evolution cares, can you survive? Can you reproduce? If you can, you're fit in terms of evolution. If you can't, you're unfit. Okay? Third one is overproduction. If you're producing something, you're making it. So overproduction is making too many of something. And in terms of overproduction and evolution, it's going to be when populations make more offspring or children than they can withstand. So prime example of this would be turtles. So sea turtles lay tons and tons of eggs, but the amount of turtles that make it from where the eggs are laid, the amount of baby turtles from where the eggs are laid to the ocean is like 10%, okay? They lay so many more turtles than can survive based on the environment, based on the resources available, based on the distance that the turtles can crawl, things like that. So overproduction happens because you want to make sure that you're passing your genes on. And if you only produce one sea turtle, the odds that that sea turtle makes it to the ocean aren't good, sadly. If you make 500, you're probably going to have a lot that make it to the ocean. So overproduction happens a lot in species because they want to pass on their genetic material. Again, the only purpose of an organism being on Earth is to survive and reproduce in terms of evolution. Okay. And then lastly is competition. So some variations make an organism better suited for survival. What this means is that they have some adaptation, they have some characteristic, some trait that makes them better suited for survival. So if we went back to the rock pocket mouse, the variation that would be better suited for the environment once the lava flow happened would be the black fur. The white fur or the tan fur would no longer be selected for because the environment changed. So when the environment can't support the overproduction of offspring, so again, if you're making too many offspring, you're going to have some that die off. Why? Competition, lack of resources, lack of food. You're going to have fighting that occurs between species, fighting over other species, etc., etc. Okay, so that's what, again, the survival of the fittest. If you have that competition, you have that struggle, not every organism can survive. So these are just snails showing overproduction. So overproduction is when they produce a lot of offspring. Snails definitely do that. We see in the top right variation, meaning that they are not all genetically the same. And then because we have those things present, we're going to have natural selection. And then inheritance, meaning that if you have a brown shell, that's because of your DNA, and that DNA can be passed on to your offspring. So you don't have a space for this, but I do want you to just know what a population is when I mention a population. So it's a group of organisms of one species living in the same place at the same time and have the ability to reproduce. Okay, so population is going to be multiple organisms of the same species. There can be competition within a population, so they can compete for food, they can compete for water, shelter, mates, etc., etc. Okay, you have this image right here. These are the finches that Darwin studied in the Galapagos, and so every one of these represents a different species. However, they all diverged or came from one species. This is what we call adaptive radiation. So adaptive radiation is when many species come or emerge from one single ancestor. What that means is there was one ancestral finch, so one finch species that gave rise to all of the species that we see here. And so you need to know what adaptive radiation is, and then that Darwin's finches are a prime example of adaptive radiation. Prime example of many species forming or emerging from one species. Okay. And again, they emerged based on what food was available in their environment. If you look, you can see that those that eat mainly insects tend to have smaller beaks. Those that eat mainly seeds have really thick and strong beaks. Those that eat cactus seeds have really long beaks because they have to go into the cactus to get the seeds. Okay, so what they eat, what's available in their environment, determines their beak shape. So natural selection is basically just determining the rate at which a species evolves. So natural selection is when a species is going to be selected for, meaning that they have some, or an organism is selected for, meaning that they have some beneficial characteristic, or selected against. So the thing that determines the rate at which a species evolves is an unequal ability of individuals to survive and reproduce. What that means is that one individual is much more likely to survive and reproduce than another. The more quickly a species reproduces, the more quickly it can evolve. So bacteria populations evolve very quickly because they reproduce so quickly and they reproduce so much that they can have those random mutations occur and be selected for much more quickly. Humans would be a species that evolves very slowly because you don't have many offspring. The average in America is less than 2. So versus bacteria, which are constantly multiplying. And then the lifespan is so long in individuals, and the generation is so long, it's probably about 30 years for humans, whereas for bacteria it could be 30 seconds. So humans are a very slowly evolving species. Bacteria are a very rapidly evolving species, and that's due to how quickly they reproduce. You have this image. I do want you to know that this is the peppered moth experiment that happened in England. It happened around the 1800s during the Industrial Revolution. And so before the Industrial Revolution occurred, you had trees that were lighter in color. Which of these moths would be selected for? So what that means is which one of these would be less likely to be killed? This one. This one would be selected for because it's harder to see. So this poor guy right here would be eaten, and you would have a higher number of white moths in the population, which we see right here, whereas the number of dark moths is much lower. As the Industrial Revolution occurred and progressed, the trees began to be covered in soot, and so they began to be darker. Well, when they're darker, the moth that is selected for would be the darker one because it's harder to see. So we would expect the darker moth population to rise, and we would see that the lighter moth population would decrease. So it's important to note that what organism is selected for can depend on the environment. At the beginning, when the trees were light, you had much more light moths because they were harder to see. As the trees began to get darker, you began to see much more dark moths in the moth population. And so that would be a prime example of microevolution, so that small term evolution of just a population changing over time. Okay. I'm going to read this to you and we're just going to kind of go over what it is. So in a specific population of salmon, one variety that exists is larger teeth, which allows some individuals in the population to survive better than others. The population density for the salmon with this adaptation is shown to be increasing each year, whereas the population of the small teeth salmon appears to be decreasing. How did natural selection cause changes in the salmon population? So if big teeth had an advantage for some reason or another, they were able to survive and reproduce more if they had larger teeth, that would mean that they would then pass that large teeth gene to their offspring. Those poor salmon with the small teeth would be less likely to survive and reproduce because it wasn't beneficial for their environment, and then they would be less likely to pass on the small tooth gene. So over time, you would see the population shift towards large tooth salmon.